Hello, everyone. Welcome to the BYU Family History webinar series. I'm Marin, and I'll be your host for this webinar. We'd love to know where you're listening from and how you heard about today's webinar. You can enter that information on the polls on the left side of the screen. Our next webinar will be on Friday, August 3rd at 4 p.m. With Simone Russell, and she'll have a presentation entitled Using Social Media for Interactive Family Histories with then that'll be with Simone. Um, and for today's webinar, we are pleased to hear from James Tanner, who will be giving a presentation entitled Online Books, Family History You May Be Missing. James Tanner has a bachelor's degree in Spanish and a master's degree in linguistics from the University of Utah. He received a Juris Doctor degree in law from the Arizona State University. He worked for 39 years as an Arizona trial attorney. He previously owned a retail computer business and an Apple Macintosh software company. James has over 35 years of experience in genealogical research and is a blogger for Genealogy's Star and the blog Rejoice and Be Exceedingly Glad. He has served for 10 years as a missionary in the Mesa, Arizona Family Search Library and is currently serving a family history mission in Maryland. He is the co-author or author of over 25 books on genealogical research and has presented at expos and conferences around the US and Canada. James has 7 children and 34 grandchildren. And as we're getting some things set up, I'll just bring your attention to the insights and comment box that's at the top left of the screen. You're welcome to provide any comments or insights that you have during the webinar. And then towards the bottom side of the left of the screen, that's where you can enter your questions. And we'll make sure that all of the questions get answered at the end of the webinar. And we're glad that you could join us, and I'll turn the time over to James.
Hello. I don't think anybody can hear me.
We can
Oh,
hear
you
you.
can. Okay, great, thanks. Here we go. And can you see my screen? There we go. Okay. I'm happy to be here. This is kind of an interesting situation when you're broadcasting from all the way across the country and at the different time zones and all of those kinds of things happening at once. Right now, this is an updated presentation. It's sort of similar. I've added a lot of different things to it, but it's similar to ones we've given before. But interestingly, and as we go through this presentation on online digital books that are available, that the numbers of digital books have continued to increase just amazingly. I mean, it's beyond almost comprehension, the number of books that are being digitized and made available online on different websites. So we'll probably jump right into it. First of all, we'll kind of address the idea of what is a digital book. And what you see in the picture is a kind of a high-end digital book scanning setup. And a digital book is basically taking an image, like a digital camera, like you can do with your phone or with a dedicated digital camera, and turning that into a text file, or in some instances, having it read into the book read into an audio file, which can then be accessed through any one of the devices that can access the internet. So most of my book reading in the last couple of years has been transferred from paper books, which are really nice, and we love to have our books around, and they're seem, sort of comforting in a way. But in the real world of practicality and convenience, we need to have, I like to have them on my devices so I can read them at odd hours and at odd times. And so I now use iPads and phones and computers to read almost everything. Interestingly, I always get this comment, the question is, when you have digitization projects, do they include books valuable to genealogists? And of course, the answer is they're not picking and choosing the books that they're digitizing. They're simply taking huge blocks of books in libraries and other locations and digitizing everything. So from the genealogical standpoint, millions of just genealogical books have been kind of sucked into the digitization projects and created a tremendous resource online of information that is valuable to genealogists. Kind of an interesting side note on this. I spent a lot of years in the Mesa Family Search Library and then additional years in the BYU Family History Library. And one of the things, both those libraries had valuable collections of genealogical books. And the number of people that I saw actually using books in the BYU Family History Library was vanishingly small. It just is amazing to me the small number of people who are very much interested in genealogical research, but seem to assume that everything they have can be found online. The answer is not all the books that are valuable have been digitized, and that of the books that there are online, then there are many of them that are valuable to genealogists. So there's still a great need to have to use genealogical books. There are hundreds, maybe thousands of websites with significant digital book collections around the world. We'll talk about and highlight some of those. This is a picture of some scribe scanners at the Internet Archive Center, and I'll get into more detail about the Internet Archive or archive.org website. But there are some major, like the Internet Archive, there are major digitization projects going on around the world, and many, many documents and many, many books are being included every day into collections online. Obviously, the advantage of paper to digital, if we've been sitting and helping Family Search and working at the Maryland State Archives, and the advantage, of course, of having the documents digitized and the books digitized is access. There are lots of books out there, and the difficulty may be that you live in a place or your libraries in your area just don't happen to carry a lot of books that are valuable for genealogy research. And the advantage is that many of these books are now digitized and available online, and many of them, millions of them, are available free without any charge. You just simply have to know where they are and how to access them. The rate of books being digitized is actually increasing. The number of books that I was seeing digitized over the past few years has been increasing so rapidly that it is almost amazing to think of the amount of information that's now available online. And there's no way to put a number on these books. Individual websites have numbers, but even if I started adding up the large number of websites, some of the websites like Google that we'll talk about, Google Books, they don't disclose how many books they have digitized online. And so it's really quite impossible to determine what that number is, but we know it's tremendously large, in the tens of millions of books. How many books have been published? Since Gutenberg Bible, well, we really don't have a handle on that either, but estimates run as high as 230 million or more But now a significant percentage of those kinds of numbers have been digitized in some time periods, such as old manuscripts and books published back before the 1500s and the 1600s, in that range. Virtually all the books that are from that time period have been digitized somewhere. So it's getting to be a situation where, yes, you do have access to a tremendous amount of information that was tied up in print books that may not have been easily accessed. So what I wanted to do in part was to discuss the kinds of books that would help genealogists with their research. And I'm going to run through a quick list here, and then what I will do is come back and discuss each one of these areas and kind of orient you to the kinds of things that you might be looking for that would aid your genealogical research. First of all, we have historical society publications. Historical societies, and I'll talk about this in more detail, have been publishing, at least in the United States, well back into the early 1800s. And there are hundreds and hundreds of societies and genealogical and historical societies around the world. And they all have some kind of a newsletter or publication or something. The biographical works, a lot of us enjoy reading biographies. What we may not realize is that there are many, many different kinds of biographical works and featured works. I'll talk about that in more detail. Genealogical journals and other publications. There are formal genealogical society journals and published journals for people with genealogical interests. These are actually quite difficult to access if they're not online, because there are very few libraries outside of large universities who may have a specific interest where these journals are available. State, county, and local histories. Almost every county in the country in the United States has written a history, and there are histories of all the English counties, and there are histories of all sorts of areas in the world. And each of these may be valuable to you as a genealogical researcher. Surname books. This is a generic category for any books that have been published about families. They either start with a famous individual or any individual, and trace their lineage back as far as it goes, or in many cases they start with a prominent individual, either an immigrant or someone who was more prominently famous for some reason or another, political figure or a very rich person or something, and then they show all the descendants of that person. So they're both ascendancy and descendancy books, kind of using the term surname books to designate all of these different categories of books that gather family histories. In fact, very many of the people that I talk to in the genealogical community are involved in writing their own surname books. In other words, they decided to compile a book of their ancestors and publish their genealogical research. And these books, once again, are even more difficult to locate, primarily because of the fact that they are very limited with publication. They have very small runs. They may only publish 10 or 12 or maybe a dozen or 2 dozen copies of the book, unless there's some financial backing, and then there may be one. Now, the categories don't tell the whole story, because there are also a huge number of instructional books, guides, manuals, and textbooks that have to do with genealogy. I got my start from one of them, and I'll talk about that. And there's other books out there that are useful to show us on how to do genealogy. There's general history and geography books. Um, it's a whole nother subject, but understanding the history and background of the area in which you're doing genealogical research is just an absolute necessity to finding the people that you are looking for and making sure that you're finding the right people and not coming up with somebody who just happens to have the same name as someone you think is your ancestor. Social and cultural commentaries. These help you to understand the context of the lives of your ancestors. It may be difficult to come up with this kind of information for some areas, but understanding the cultural context and the social context, where your people lived, how they lived, and how they made their livings, will suggest records that could be researched and found for almost anyone. Transcripts and reproductions of records. This has been going on for years. We think of microfilm, we think of digital copies. We also need to think of the need for transcriptions and reproductions of the records. These are books that are published out. One of the sets of books that I used a lot was called the Westlaw Reporter Series. These are transcripts and reproductions of court decisions and other governmental agency decisions across the United States. Huge libraries of this information, and sometimes we overlook that kind of source for information about our families. Archive and library publications. Many libraries, not just larger libraries, have published guides to their collections, or the archives have published highlights of the collections, or even catalogs of all the information that they have online. And these are valuable books, and many of these are being found kind of making their way into the online digital world. So now let's look at some specific types of books, and these are documents or collections that are online that lead us to the digital copies of the records that we would like to find about our ancestors. This is the Periodical Source Index, or Percy. It was developed by the Allen County Public Library in Allen County and in the United States, but now it's owned by Find My Past, which is a large online database. Was purchased by them, or the rights to it in any event, and they have over 2.7 million searchable entries. Now, what are these? These entries are periodicals. That means they're journals, they're newsletters, they're magazines, they're other types of documents that come out, which are called generically by libraries are called serials, and the serial publications, meaning they're published from time to time, either once a year, twice a year, every month, once a week, whatever. And for many, many years, they have been collected and made available in an online database called Percy, or Periodical Source Index. And this is now the entries on this, where they are available, are being digitized by Find My Past. So previously, you would have had to go into Percy, find an article that you thought might apply to one of your ancestors, and then there was a process where you filled out a form, sent some money off to the Allen County Public Library, and then they would send you back a photocopy of the article. But in this case, what's happening is that they're being digitized by Find My Past, and they're searchable now online on that website, findmypast.com. So this is kind of the kind of thing that is getting us the availability of these articles, which were basically the kinds of things that you would never be able to find outside of this particular collection. if your people came, for example, let's pull a place out of the air, they came from some county in Georgia or Mississippi or someplace in the southern part of the United States, it is very, very likely that they had a historical society or a genealogical society associated with that county or that area. And it's very, very, very likely that the Percy index has an index to the articles and records, and now we have access to that through findmypast.com. So this is what it is. It's a comprehensive index of articles and records in historical, genealogical, and ethnic publications. There's actually 3 million entries, more than 3 million fully searchable entries now. That's the changes that I'm going to throughout this, and I said at the beginning this is updated. You're going to see numbers that jump by hundreds of thousands or millions from anything that I've talked about previously. And this is a valuable place to go for things that you may never have seen before. Now, a little more here about historical society publications. This is another kind of association or society that has been created. This one, the Massachusetts Historical Society, dates back to 1791, and you can understand if you go back into those original publications, historical publications, and your ancestors lived in Massachusetts during that time period, there is a possibility that some article or some mention or some even extensive mentions or articles about your family may have been incorporated in these kinds of materials. Now, some of these society materials, and we have to raise at this point the issue of copyright. In the United States, there are varying degrees of copyright restrictions beginning around 1923. So documents and records and books published before 1923 are primarily, not completely, because there are some exceptions and the law can be quite confusing. But for the most part, material published before 1923 is what's available and called the public domain, meaning anyone who wishes can copy or use the material without restrictions. After 1923, and more recently, we have copyright restrictions. Some articles may or may not be subject to copyright. So what you're going to see, particularly with documents like this from a publication that came out periodically from the Massachusetts Historical Society, is that the old ones before 1923 are probably going to be available in digital copies online. And however, newer examples of the publication may be restricted to members of the Historical Society, or may be available only in certain libraries or things of that nature. So you may have to do some searching, and they still may be digitized, but they may only be restricted to someone who belongs to the society. So what do? Well, if you find out that they have a lot of your information, you join the society. That may be the least expensive route to obtaining the information that you're searching for. So in each case, I'm going to try to give you search terms for finding the information. In this case, we search for historical society plus the location. So if you want to know if the historical society for a state, go put in historical society. I want to put that in quotes probably on Google, and then a location like Arizona, Massachusetts, California, Idaho, whatever, and then put in, and that will give you any organizations that would be related to historical society. Use your imagination when you're searching to come up with additional terms that may be helpful. This one, for example, is 1798. This is published back then. The important thing to remember on these older publications is that they were written at the time that many of your ancestors were still alive. So the information can be considered to be, in a lot of cases, more reliable than it would have been, than you would think from an old publication. Unfortunately, there's kind of an attitude amongst some genealogists that I found that old material lacks sources and is unreliable, and that simply ignores the fact that these items were written at the time in the 1800s when the people you are searching for were still alive, or their close relatives were still alive. Biographical works. Interestingly enough, you think of novels, biographical novels, and biographies that you might find in your local library. This is a little more expansive than that. Many of the histories of the county include biographies of prominent citizens. Sometimes those biographies of the prominent citizens were included because they were the ones who footed the bill for the publication of the history. But this is still a valuable source of information. It may even have a picture of your ancestor done from life that you did not know exist. The important thing to understand here is that you need to be doing research that identifies the places where your ancestors lived. The place is more important sometimes than having an exact date or even an exact name. If you find the place, then you're likely to find records that will help you to correct names and correct dates. But if you have a date and a name, it's not going to help you a lot if you haven't got the right place. So these are this important kind of records that have been created for many, many years. For instance, here, this is Bristol County, Massachusetts, and the title of this is History of Bristol County, Massachusetts, with biographical sketches of many of its pioneers and prominent men. The key word here is pioneers. If your ancestors were the first or among the very first people to settle in any particular area of the country or of the United States or Canada or anywhere else for that matter, then those early people who lived in that area are generally the ones recorded in the histories. Even if they weren't prominent, they were still first. And this one was published back in 1883, and so you're going to have people who were still living at the time this was published, who were born in the 1700s. So this is the kind of thing that you need to know how much time frame you can cover with some of these history books. The search terms here are history, or the word history, or biography with the state, county, or city. It helps to be more specific, but you might want to start generally looking for the biographies. There are, by the way, huge publications across the United States that are subscription type publications where people who are prominent in a community or famous are compiled in books that are sold. So, for instance, they will say, for only $500, we will include your name in our publication as one of the famous people in the United States. And so people will do that. And these are also valuable to search for additional information. Even if your ancestors weren't that prominent or they weren't that rich, they still may end up being mentioned in some of these publications. Okay, so now going on to genealogical journals and other publications. This is always an interesting situation because these are extremely valuable, but unfortunately they're not very accessible. It's kind of hard to find these. You can go to, you're not going to find these in your local public library. You may not even find some of these journals in your in a big university library. It just depends on how inclusive their catalogers and their people who are acquiring books for the library. But very large libraries will have these books. Specialty libraries like the Family History Library in Salt Lake City, or any other library that has a specific interest in Massachusetts history for some reason, or New England history, will obviously try to have copies of these journals. The advantage, once again, is many of these are now online. This particular one, the covers that I'm showing here of the books are digital copies of the books of these particular publications that I found online. So this one, the New England Historical and Genealogical Register, which is still being published, is by the New England Historical Genealogy Society, and it's been published since the 1800s, and it contains articles written by competent genealogists for well over 150 years, and lots of names in there, and they have indexes, in each volume of the register has an index of names, as do many of the other publications. And these can be searched online. On Google, if you do a Google search, and I'll talk about that in a moment, you'll find that these are available. And you search for a journal, use the word journal or register or one of the other associated terms with the term genealogy. And it always helps to put in a location you're looking for so that you can add the location. And then you'll find listings of these online. And always then check on in some of the large online digital book websites that have this information to see if there are digital copies of those books available, and I'll show you how that works. State and county and local history. Here's an illustrated history of Grayson County, Texas, and this was published by the Women's Clubs in Grayson County. And here's something that's a benefit from this. This is some pictures out of this particular publication showing Sunday school classes and in the Methodist Church in Grayson County. And you may very well find a picture of your ancestors in this kind of publication that you could not imagine existed. And this is quite a treat here to find this kind of a publication online. As I mentioned a moment ago, virtually every county in the United States has some sort of historical publication. They've either been around long enough to have a 50th or a 100th or a 200th or even more, many more years a celebration of some kind, and they generally publish some kind of a document, that a book or a program or whatever that shows information about the early pioneers or the people who are living in the county. As I say here, you might be surprised at what you find, and the name here you search for is the location plus history, and this needs to be specific. You can start with cities, towns, counties, townships. All sorts of organizations might have published a history of some kind about their area. And I mentioned surname books, and this is a surname book. This is one from that comes from my family, William Tanner in North Kingston, Rhode Island, and his descendants. And the question for here is to check for valid sources. This particular book, first one was published in 1905. There was another one published a few years later in 1910 called William Tanner of South Kingston, Rhode Island. the interesting thing is that this book was not researched by someone who lived in Rhode Island, where these people lived, but by one of my relatives who lived in uh, Faribault, Maine, Minnesota, I mean, excuse me, Faribault, Minnesota. And as far as I can tell from the book, he never visited Rhode Island and did all of his research by letters. The information as it is in there is fairly accurate as far as listing people, but unfortunately not accurate in listing how they are related. So there's a lot of names in there, and there's a lot of references to different records, but there's no connection, no way showing how these people are actually connected, and it's created a tremendous controversy in our family as to who these people actually were. But you know, I have found surname books that had every paragraph and every citation of every record in the book with a citation to a record that could be found, to birth and death and vital records and census records and everything. Just some of those, so you never know. Sometimes they might be very helpful. Sometimes they might be something that you'll wish that you had that nobody had ever seen. You can search for your surname or complete name plus location and genealogy. So if for instance, here, if you put in William Tanner in Rhode Island and you put in genealogy, then this book will come up because there are many, many copies of this that have been digitized in various different websites. Now, instructional books, and I mentioned that I got my start is with some instructional books and guides and manuals and textbooks. The first major book that I read that helped me get started doing accurate and good genealogy was The Researcher's Guide to American Genealogy, and I had the third edition. That's by Valdi Greenwood. And he just published a fourth edition of this book. And I mentioned that in one of my blog posts about the fourth edition of this book. And I'm going to probably get a copy of it, but not until I get back to Provo from Maryland. We're sort of limited in what we can carry, and we're trying hard not to buy a bunch of books back here in Maryland. This is another one that I used that I found to be extremely valuable and helpful as I got started in genealogy. It's called The Source, and this book has been digitized. It is online. It was incorporated into the Ancestry Wiki. You may not have known that Ancestry.com had a wiki, but if you look for that Ancestry Wiki, you'll find that it has complete and updated information that was originally came from this book called The Source. Very, very helpful one. And there are some trade books out there on genealogy. There's a complete Idiot's Guide to Genealogy. There's quite a bit of information out there that you can find. You're likely to find these kinds of books in a local public library if you find any books on genealogy. They will probably have something like this, like these books, rather than the reference books or books that contain a lot of biographical and record information. Very helpful if you haven't done it. Read a history of wherever you're doing genealogy. If you don't remember your American history, then you're going to find out that you're ultimately lost in doing your genealogical research. You just need to know that, and you need to know the local histories, not to recite for a test, but basically to understand when you have a question that you need to know the context of the time period of when the people were arriving, what they were settling, how they lived, where they might have been employed. I've recently found out information that's been extremely helpful to me simply by going back into the history and doing some research into the history. Not things that I would have known or would have ever been covered in a class that I took about history of the United States, but is important for understanding exactly how my ancestors made it from Connecticut up to Vermont, for example, and things like that, all of the historical things. Geography is also helpful. If you don't have a basic idea of where your people lived, that's helpful to always look up the places where your ancestors lived on a program like Google Maps, and then use the street view to see where it was they lived. I do this routinely with almost every location that I see or ask about, simply so I know that if it was in a city, in a town, in a country, in the mountains, in the forest, in the on the seashore, wherever this place was, so I have at least a visual concept of some of the things that may be important about my family or the ancestral lines that I'm researching for someone. Here you search for history or geography plus the topic. If you want American history, you want history of Vermont, you want the history of wherever, you're going to find the books. And again, if you find an old history book, it's not necessarily, history doesn't go out of date. Just because the book was published back in the 1940s or even 1800s or whatever, it's very much more. For example, Civil War, U.S. Civil War, there were many commemorative books that were published at the end of the Civil War. Then moving off into up towards the present, the number of books about the U.S. Civil War almost disappeared entirely being published until 100 years after the Civil War, and then they began to publish more books about the U.S. Civil War. Now there are thousands of books written about the Civil War. So the only thing I would give here is to be cautious and watch out for political and social propaganda. You need to have a perspective so that if your people were minorities or if your people had some involved in some kind of social issues of the day or whatever, if they were immigrants and came to America, you may find out that the history has been substantially rewritten for one side or the other. So just be careful when you're reading these books. The same with social and cultural commentaries. Now, this is an interesting example of social and cultural commentary. It's called Albion Seed, Four British Folkways in America. It's by David Hackett Fisher. I would, for example, this book, I would recommend to anyone who has anybody in their line that came from England. This book is extremely valuable in giving you an understanding of the context and the way that the people lived and why they came here and what happened to them when they got here to America. And this is the kind of thing that gives you a vast amount of information. These ones that are copyrighted, like Albion Seed, are probably digitized. You could probably buy a digital copy of this book, but they're not going to be available free online with many of the other things that you'll see. But as I mentioned at the beginning, watch out for political and social. They're difficult to find, by the way. They're not the kind of book that is generally on the shelf in a local public library. And you really need to kind of dig through larger catalogs and get a feel for the books. You will find these books in larger university and libraries such as that, or in genealogy libraries that specialize in books on genealogy. I mentioned transcripts and reproductions of records. This is indexed probate records of the county of Suffolk, Massachusetts. This was published clear back in 1895. And These kinds of books are online and digitized and available to look at. They are helpful because they are another source of a way to get into the records. And in some cases, they not only include an index, but they can include transcripts of all of the records. I was recently looking, not recently, but the last year or two, I've been looking for information about some of my relatives in Vermont, and found a book where someone had transcribed the probate records from the area of Vermont where my family lived, and I was able to find the probate for my ancestor that no one, I believe, had ever seen before, because no one had ever made reference to it or cited it or posted it online. And so these are the kinds of things that you may well discover through looking for these. Search for the jurisdiction, the place, and the record type, and include the word book, and that would bring up this kind of a record. Archive and library publications, you really, this is an area, once again, you need to be aware of all of the archives and libraries. And when you're looking for archive and library publications, it's a good idea to search for the name of the library and the archive. Now, Google Books. Google has been digitizing books for many years. There's a section called Google Books where you can search and focus on the books, and it's a comprehensive index of the full text of the books, meaning every word in the book can be searched. The estimate is that there are over 30 million digitized books, and of those, more than 1 million are genealogy-related books on Google. Google does not, as I mentioned, provide the number of books that they have digitized. They do come in 3 different categories. The read books are completely digitized and completely searchable, and you can read them online or even download a copy to your computer. There's a snippet view for those that are in the gray area of not knowing whether or not they're still covered by copyright, and they will give you excerpts from the book. And the third area is a preview, and a preview of the book means the book is digitized, but it will let you know if the book exists and where it can be found. In conjunction, the read is the complete text and completely searchable. So if I was to look up this book, it would say read, and when I looked at the book, I would have the entire transcript, a digital copy of the book that was searchable. Snippet version, this is what it looks like. This is usually a copyright issue problem. This book was published during a time when it was uncertain whether it was still covered by copyright claims. And so it will give you just a portion of the book, and it will call it the snippet view. And then a preview of the book is any book that's currently for sale or has a copyright limitation, and only certain pages may be viewed, but those pages are not necessarily the ones you want to look at. So you'll have to find a copy of those books if you want to see the entire book. After Google, where you want to go is worldcat.org. Worldcat is a catalog of library catalogs, and there are over 2 billion entries in Worldcat. This is number after Google. This is my in my top 5 of programs that I would use to initiate any research on any topic, and particularly on genealogical research. Basically, you can search on any name or topic or whatever you want to search by. Have to understand that this is a catalog. This is not a full text search like Google. So you're going to have to guess whether or not your topic has been put in the title or in a catalog entry in a book by one of the libraries. And once you go there, you can look at the editions of the book that are available, and in many cases it will notify you if an electronic copy of the book, a digitized copy of the book, is available. So here's, for example, a book, that same William Tanner book. This is the South Kingstown one, and it shows a little, with the arrow here showing you that you can find an ebook, and it's a copy of the 1910 book that was published. Good idea to look for books in the public domain. The reason why is that these books are readily available online, and you can download them if you wish to do that. And generally speaking, they're completely searchable word for word because they've used what's called optical character recognition to read all the books. And this is where you're starting to see the huge numbers go up. They can't even keep up with it in their own website. When I last looked at this, they had around just a month or so ago, they had 14 million books. And now I looked at it just in updating this particular presentation, and the number had jumped to almost 17 million books. That's a lot of books in just a few months, in just a couple of months' time. And that's kind of the way that these numbers are going up. This is the core source place for a tremendous amount of genealogical material. It's the Internet Archive, known as archive.org. If you are not familiar with this program, I strongly suggest that you become familiar with it. Now, actually, there are over 17 million books. It's very close to getting to that. Another huge collection of books with a huge number of public domain books is the Hothi Trust and the hothitrust.org. This is a selection of universities across the United States that have banded together to put their books into one consolidated collection. And they have over 6 million volumes in the public domain. The complete collection is very much larger, but it simply points you to the library. If you are a member, if you are part of a university, student, faculty, or staff, you may have access to the Hothi Trust and be able to read all the books. But if you're not, then the ones that you do have access to are the over 6 million volumes there. Family Search has a huge collection of very specifically books, genealogically relevant books, because they are in the process of digitizing the books that they have in the library. The last count was 372,000 digital books from 18 major libraries that specialized in genealogical collections. So this is a major one. There are some restrictions of using books in the, let me go back, of using books from the Family Search books selection. Some of them may be in the catalog, but may only be viewable in family history centers or in the family history library itself. So there's a possibility that there may be some copyright issues, and the books are only available by going and looking at the book in the library. So this is another huge selection of books. You may not be aware of this kind of website at all. This is called the openlibrary.org, and it's part of the Internet Archive, which is the archive.org website that I just mentioned a moment ago. This is a huge open library. This has a huge number of books, more than 1 million books. It's much, much larger than your local public library. It's free. It's accessible. You register, and then you're able to check books out for 2 weeks at a time. And I have found books that I otherwise could not find anyplace else, and I was able to check them out. They weren't in any of the libraries, local libraries. They weren't in my university library. They weren't any place that I could find. And now I've been able to check them out by going to the open library and using it like I had an open library card. And if you'd like to read, There is an unending list of books here to read. And you can check these books out and read them on any of your devices. So this is, this is a tremendous way to get into information that you may not otherwise be available. There's also a huge organization called Overdrive.com. This is a commercial organization that has is lets local public libraries join this by subscription service. And they have more than 30,000 libraries in 40 countries that are signed up to Overdrive. And they basically check out books from your local public library. So when you get a library card, if your library has access to Overdrive, then you can go in here with your library card number and check books out for 2 weeks. And then they check themselves back in automatically. So saves any possibility of fines and also makes them available. Between my wife and I think we constantly have books checked out from our local public library as a result of having Overdrive access. Amazingly, here's the last suggestion here is visit a library. If you haven't been to a library for a while, find out where your closest public library is and go visit. Ask them what kinds of information they may have. If you're traveling and you want to do research about your family in a particular area, you should probably start with the local public library and talk to them about the resources that might be available in the community. This is an extremely valuable way to do research. And it's also helpful to get you back to reality when you can go look and walk the shelves and see the real books that are still there. Oh, but before you worry about it, check to see if the book's already been digitized before you get worrying about whether or not the book is available. And the rule here, as it is with many of the areas in genealogy, is to keep looking online. Keep searching in the catalogs. I've only been able to touch on just a small number of the places where there are digital collections online of books and records of all kinds. And this is the way you continue to do. Okay, I'd like to thank you for watching. And if you're wondering in this picture, yes, that bench and the garbage can were sitting in the water in the tidal basin. So it's not an optical illusion. Any questions? Anybody out there? Did I lose everybody somehow? Okay. Well, thank you all for tuning in. And I guess we'll see if Maren wants to say something before we leave.
All right, thank you so much. If there's any more questions, go ahead and type those in. Next week's webinar will be on the 3rd of August, and that will be with Simone Russell. And she will be having a presentation entitled, where did it go? That's going to be a presentation with Simone using social media for interactive family histories. And if you have any feedback or comments, please enter that on the polls on the left side of the screen. And you can always reach us at fhl_webinars@byu.edu. And thank you so much for your patience. We had a couple of technical difficulties, but we made it through without any trouble. Thank you so much and have a wonderful week.